My presentation is still trying to sort out the link, but I'll start. So, We Live in Silence was a film I worked on last year, but then it had been a process for a couple of years. It wasn't that was the final point of the production. I think making the film has been, I guess, 3 or 4 years prior to last year. And it involved a very important thinking process, and which started when I lived in South Africa, because I lived in South Africa for 12 years, then after 12 years I moved back to Zimbabwe. And my experience has always been, I've always looked at Zimbabwe from the outside because I lived in South Africa. So when I moved home, I started looking at Zimbabwe from the inside. And that, I think, altered the kind of space I needed to work from. So We Live in Silence came from that thinking space. And it came from a space where you felt a repressive silence as to what you can or cannot say, who you can associate with, and who you can't associate with. So you navigated and negotiated your spaces depending on your political thought, your socially and economically. So these were boundaries that you negotiated and paid like a toll to get through. So in thinking about this process and also looking at Zimbabwean history, it has always been what I believe has been a traumatized country from its inception. And for me, growing up, I think others would refer as the born-free generation. I often never refer to myself as a born-free generation. I just say I was born, and that's the end of the story. The rest is a life I have lived. So I've always kind of looked at it that way. So the next step had been, what did this trauma mean to everyone else, apart from myself and the people who lived in Zimbabwe, those that also left and those that also stayed. And what I'd come to understand was that it had been a traumatizing silence. It has been a silence where people have not been able to express this anger, this frustration, and this hope. Because this hope was built into the silence that you're promised gold, basically. But then my argument against that is miracles don't happen. Miracle is like when someone turns air into gold, that's a miracle. Political decisions are human decisions. It does not involve a miracle. It involves self-activity, self-involvement, and that's where you realize not only a miracle, but then your progress in evolution. So this had been my thinking process as to how to look at this work and how to develop it. So I started looking at archives and exploring how this process can begin. So one of the most interesting books I think came across was a book by Professor Mdimbe, which was The Invention of Africa, which I found it striking because its proposition was, you're not an African. You can define who you are as you go on, because this process is to eternity. Long after I'm gone, people will be defining themselves differently. Our cultures will evolve, our cultures will change. Maybe there might not be any cultures. Maybe we'll all be digital matter floating around on the internet. We might not even have bodies. So for me, it became an interesting point to start, is that, well, if this is an invention, then what am I? So his perspective was that things didn't necessarily change, the process evolved. So the missionary became the theologian and the evangelist. The politician evolved from being the native commissioner. So it wasn't change that was taking place, it was a synchronicity that taking place, systems synchronizing as they develop, because you don't want to disrupt the system. You don't want the system disrupt that is based on wage labor. You need to maintain wage labor. So for the colonies to grow and to maintain post-independence, these synchronized systems had to be maintained. So in his writing, it was what he proposed as the invention of Africa, it's like the synchronicity. Which then, for me, is what I then refer to. We don't live in post-independence or post-colonies. We live in colonial futures, because these are futures that are synchronized with the past, that haven't reformed or haven't changed. So for me, this is where it was going. It was like, so in exploring these thoughts, it was, well, then there's a sense of silence about this, that we exist in this feedback loop, that we're constantly going round and round and repeating the same things over and over again, which is also then a challenge to the speakers and the participants of the conference, is what has changed since 1960. Are we still asking for miracles, turning air into gold? So this was process then evolved into, there was a film I watched in Berlin, and I found it probably one of the most interesting films made in 1970 by Med Hondo. And it told the story of a migrant just after post-independence, leaves for France to seek work and opportunities. This promised land of, well, I refer to it as the after party. The post-colonial after party. So he sought out, he traveled to Paris to look for work, but then what surprised him was that it hadn't changed. He was a black man in Paris looking for work. The system was indifferent to him. There was naked racism everywhere. And this grew within him and became the silence, which became an integral part of how he interacted with everyone else. One of the interesting dialogues in the film is between the lead character of a migrant and an aristocrat. And he then explains to him, like, it is crucial to be able to select individuals capable of speaking as we do, capable of thinking as we do, capable of returning, of absorbing the words as we do. Above all, giving them the same meaning. So there will soon be millions of whitewashed blacks, whitewashed and economically enslaved. So this was a central dialogue in the film, which I thought captured exactly what I wanted to say about we live in silence. And it was a battle to figure out then visually where then do I start in telling this story. And this silence always, one is, it's a position that one is traumatizing and yet also one inflicts trauma on you. So because I trained as an artist and I wanted to use art history as one of the best ways to communicate these ideas. So I started with Caravaggio. So Caravaggio's Judith Beheading Holofernes was really interesting because the story it tells of a tyrant being beheaded and Judith saving her community and family. But it's also like the nature of the violence that's also important, because someone so traumatized by violence then essentially then explodes in reaction. So for me, this was really interesting in terms of how this can be a beginning point for telling we live in silence and the impact and the ramifications of doing so. So it didn't only stop there. There's also, I became really interested. There's also another painting made by Artemisia Gentileschi, which was Judith slaying Holofernes, which is also really interesting because it's a reference to the story, the biblical story of Judith slaying Holofernes, but then in this case it was really interesting because it was personal. It became a personal story. So the artist herself was raped by a mentor, and he was taken to court, and justice was not done. So she made this painting in response to what had happened. So it is Judith, it is actually Artemisia slaying her mentor. So that those years of silence essentially came alive and lived in some sense. And I think it might have been a process that made one of the earliest feminist artists. And it is also interesting in thinking that it's also, how then do we understand these stories within an African context? Because that's essentially where I wanted to use the ideas of art history and the way art history communicates these ideas, and try and capture them in a way that I think people would understand and find a thread or a point of entry. So after going through this process, I eventually came up with one of the ways to do this was actually subvert art history as an interesting way of looking and challenging these ideas and having a narrative that is one localized, but then it's also global in the sense that every time you want to make a work, you're trying to participate globally. So my result was an interpretation of the painting, which was We Live in Silence, which is two black women beheading a white man. So then this becomes an interesting point because you're now not only looking at art history, you're now looking at centuries of political history, centuries of economic history that are now packed into an image. And then how then do you begin to unpack this thinking, this approach, and what comes out of it? So why would two black women behead a white man will be your first question. And I think exploring the historical context of slavery, colonization, imperialism, wage labor, would be one of the ways of tackling art history and examining art history and trying to localize it in a way that my friends can understand, my mother can understand, my grandmother can understand, but then also be able to participate globally because the image, the original reference to Judith and Holofernes is one from a biblical story, and also secondly, one painted in so many other ways and interpreted in so many ways. So this became the evolution of the thinking as to we live in silence. So the challenge then becomes how then do we interpret the image when within a contemporary setting, who then represents the white man, who then represents the two black women, and it's not just two black women in suits. So then it's also subverting the language of power and authority, of patriarchy and matrilinear societies. So for me, it was also challenging those norms, challenging those ideas. How then do we think about these challenges? For others, other people have interpreted the beheading as capitalism. Others have interpreted the beheading as the internet. Because in some sense, ending tyrannical systems can give a cathartic response, can be, well, this is the beginning of something new. You've cut the head of the beast. You've cut the head of the Leviathan, so now you can begin to start again. So it has different approaches, different perspectives. One way of looking at it is that, well, we can kill capitalism, we can behead it, and begin a liberated zone. That's a new start. Then what is a liberated zone? It's a space where you're able to determine your own future based on your knowledge and not willing to say we're going to compromise and speak the same language and mean the same things as the central aristocrat character had said, is that you can give new meanings in new language to everything. So for me, it becomes a really interesting place to be, is that if these new meanings to language, new meanings to capitalism, then what will they be? Then becomes the challenge. How will we define them? What will we want them to be? How will they operate? What is the language? How do we learn those new things? So for me, then becomes this process, is how do we come to this point where we can look at a world entirely differently. We can essentially create our own worlds entirely differently. If you're willing to behead the monster, the tyrant. So that's how We Live in Silence kind of came about, because it's almost like it's a point of it's a challenge. Like, how then do we look at these futures in this way? And then so how then do we look at futures with the participation of Black women, as a lot of our text and writing and visual culture has erased Black women from these spaces. So it's also then reflecting on those ideas in terms of our texts, our academic work, film, literature. How then do we overturn those systems and make them more equal, or even make them more representative? Because my thinking is that more representative you have, it's just, I think, in most populations, women are the majority, and therefore all presidents should be female. That'll be my argument. So it's then looking at those things, like how then do we challenge those discussions, and where should they go? So this is my contribution to, or my thoughts to We Live in Silence. Does anyone have questions?
You were making a comment on the aftermath of the killing, right? So, is it really is the importance of the murder, the killing, is it hinged on the absence of, let's say, the white man, or really the identity that is ingrained in the person? Because then, for instance, colonialism created some kind of identity for the person. So, is the fight against uprooting the identity, or just killing the person who created the identity?
It's not necessarily killing the identity. It is what has traumatized you. It's defining the trauma that it has created. So it doesn't necessarily, like, poverty is traumatizing. Poverty is tyrannical in that it traumatizes you in that way. So how then do you behead poverty? Then it becomes my response to you. So it's not necessarily looking at an individual or a place or a particular race. It's what do you define as something that is traumatizing? And how then do you respond to it? You get what I'm saying?
So in the beginning too, you were talking about how, like, it's kind of a loop, right? And it's repairing. Why do you want to define the loop as starting from colonialism? Because before colonialism, there wasn't anything like that. Is it that the loop started from colonialism? And why is it that it started then? And why does the white person get to control it?
No, the loop isn't. The loop looks at post-independence. It looks at the first African countries that gained independence. Like, there was a celebratory tone to it, 60s, and then something happened. And then this loop became endless. And living in Zimbabwe, I experienced that loop every 10 years. Like, I can give you an example. So, since 1980, there seems to be a pattern where after every 2 presidential terms, there's always a collapse. So, the first one would have been ESAP, the Structural Adjustment Program, in the 90s. Then the second one was the land invasions Then the third one then came in 2008 when hyperinflation. Then the fourth one was what is now happening currently. So it's these loops that have been taking place.
So pre-colonialism didn't exist?
Pardon?
Pre-colonialism didn't exist?
It's not looking at pre-colonial. It's looking what has happened after. It's looking at that loop because what we've come to define like our spaces are the spaces we live in and how we interact with those spaces. How then do we define those spaces? What knowledge do we use to define those spaces? So for me, it's understanding how that loop has taken place. That it's almost like we can't get out of it. It's like a feedback loop. It continues up until the speaker blows. So at some point, you're expecting the speaker to blow, but you don't know when it will.
I understand this artist like a reimagine or something else. So, but what do you think about the portrayal of the silence with Dave?
The silence is when it's atonement. It becomes, it's like you build these multiple personalities because the longer it takes that spaces for you to communicate. Because mostly, I think everyone wants to communicate and participate globally. But then if that is taken away from you, you also take away, in some sense, your language. It limits your language, essentially. So this language starts to grow inside, and then these become these personalities, I think, which developed within my own space, my own head, is that I started to live in silence, and the only people that existed were the multiple characters in my head. So it was kind of dealing with those things, and hence I lived in silence. But then all of these conversations were taking place in my private space.
The image is very provocative, so I'd like to know, coming from a country that has so-called white Africans population, how was the image received?
I haven't shown this image in Zimbabwe. But I think other people have seen it, have been there've been very different responses. I think people have called it kind of blasphemous, because it's also in reference to the Bible story. Like, how can you portray such a story in this way? And then it's also, how then do you understand the political dynamics within your private space? So what then, because yes, you would see this white man, has been headed, but then what I remember being gone to, it's like, it depends on what you allocate that to, what you define that to be. Because like I said, poverty can be a tyrant, and it can traumatize you. But then there's also how then did that process kind of build up to a point where you eventually have to respond to it. Then what do you do? So the responses have been very different in terms of, do you interpret the image literally? Do you also kind of provide a historical and political context to it? Do you also look at it from a religious point of view? Because there are all these kind of different angles and perspectives you can also approach the work from. So for me, it's been really interesting, the different ideas that people have brought forward as a result of it. And it's also challenging, because it's like, well, that's the guy that wants to kill white people. It's like, no, that is not the case. But then also have to look at it historically as to how these relationships have evolved, how they've changed, and whether it's still a loop that is endless.
Thank you very much. Don't be silent. Put your hands together for him.
Well, thank you for coming.